Welcome to This Explanator. Today, we're going to completely shatter that mainstream image of the perfect, hyperproductive, always optimistic founder. You know the one. Instead, we're diving into what really drives people to start businesses. And trust me on this, the reality is far more complex and honestly way more bizarre than the hustle culture myths you see all over social media. Because, think about it. What if the drive to build a business isn't just about having a great idea? What if it's actually born from spite, or desire to slack off, or, wait for it, even a literal brain parasite? Seriously. Okay, let's just dive straight into this wild taxonomy of a founder. We're going to explore 21 fascinating, weird, and highly controversial theories straight from our source material. To map out this massive spectrum of entrepreneurial behavior, we'll hit this in 5 rapid-fire parts. 1. The misfits and rebels. 2. Biology, brains, and parasites. 3. The psychological edge. 4. Capital, networks, and systems. And 5. Innovation and market strategy. Let's get into it. All right, part 1. The misfits and rebels. So there are 3 distinct ways that social friction actually pushes people into entrepreneurship. First up is the marginal man theory. This highlights how being excluded from traditional paths to power literally forces individuals to channel their ambition into economic innovation instead. Next, we've got the misfit theory, which shows how cultural clashes, something often experienced by immigrants, can make traditional employment feel super restrictive, which prompts them to just build their own microcultures. And finally, the withdrawal of status respect theory. This one is fascinating. It shows how a social group suffering a loss of prestige will actually use entrepreneurship to creatively rebel and regain their social standing over generations. Now check out the stark contrast here with rogue theory. Look, most business activity is what we call conforming entrepreneurship, meaning it basically aligns with what experts think is a good idea. But rogue entrepreneurship, it explicitly violates expert consensus. Rogue founders, like the creators of Airbnb or SpaceX, actually use the protective bulwark of expert rejection to their absolute advantage. I mean, when everyone agrees an idea is completely impossible, it clears out all the competition. It allows the rogue to just build a monopoly right in the shadows. And executing that kind of rebellion requires a very specific mindset. Enter Gladwell's disagreeableness theory. We see this with founders like IKEA's Ingvar Kamprad. He famously outsourced production to Cold War Poland in the 1960s, despite massive, and I mean massive, public backlash in Sweden. It completely proves that a total indifference to social approval is a huge competitive advantage. Basically, you simply cannot need the validation of your peers if you really want to change the world.
Moving right along to part 2, biology, brains, and parasites.
The absolute crucial point here is that your physical hardware really matters. First, the physiological theory literally links prenatal testosterone exposure to adult risk-taking. Wild, right? Next, the neurodiversity framework reframes cognitive differences like ADHD and autism not as deficits, but as absolute superpowers for hyperfocus and ambiguity tolerance. Oh, and crucially, we really need to debunk the low sleep theory. Sacrificing rest is just a toxic hustle culture myth. Getting a full night of sleep is actually a biological prerequisite for taking calculated risks and maintaining your cognitive flexibility. But if we're going to talk about biology, we have to look at the bizarre brain parasite theory. Okay, so recent studies have found that individuals infected by Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite carried by cats, are significantly more likely to pursue high-risk ventures. Why? Because the infection rewires their dopamine levels and quite literally, biologically suppresses their fear of failure. No way, right? But it's absolutely true. So before we explore internal drives in our next section, we kind of have to pause and ask a really serious question based on what we've just seen. Is entrepreneurship an achievement or is it an addiction? Let's take a closer look at that razor-thin line between healthy ambition and dangerous pathology. Welcome to part 3. The psychological edge. Okay, we can group 3 major internal drivers here. First up is McClelland's achievement motivation. That's the healthy, intrinsic drive to excel and grow. Second is emancipation theory, which is the intentional pursuit of liberation. This is where founders, like the creators of Google for instance, build companies just to break free from rigid authority structures. And third is the hubris theory. Now, absolute overconfidence is a total double-edged sword. It allowed Elon Musk to confidently build SpaceX when everyone laughed at him, sure, but that exact same hubris is what ultimately destroyed Theranos when operations failed. But we also need to objectively look at the dark side of this drive. The addiction theory of entrepreneurship reveals that the high of closing deals and taking massive risks can trigger intense dopamine loops. And this leads some founders to completely neglect their health and their families, all just to maintain the aesthetic of the heroic founder. It actually mirrors the exact physiological patterns of drug tolerance. It's pretty intense.
All right, on to part 4, capital, networks, and systems.
So our understanding of systemic advantage has evolved drastically over the last century. Back in the early 1900s, Max Weber proposed the Protestant ethic theory, basically arguing religious frameworks drove capitalism, a view that's heavily challenged today for its cultural bias, by the way. By the 1970s, the focus shifted to agency theory, which highlighted the structural friction and information asymmetry between investors and the founders they hire. Then, by the 1980s, the liquidity constraints theory laid bare a pretty harsh reality. Personal wealth and access to cash are the primary gateways to startup entry. Oftentimes, it literally just takes money to make money.
Diving into social capital theory reveals a highly counterintuitive truth about your network. It turns out that weak ties, your shallow acquaintances, are actually way more valuable for finding new business opportunities than your close friends. Now, why is that? It's because acquaintances act as bridges across structural holes in your network. They bring you entirely novel information that your immediate tight-knit circle just doesn't have access to.
And finally, part 5, innovation and market strategy. Founders can completely upend markets by capitalizing on 3 really unique strategic gaps. First, through X-efficiency. They can step in and exploit the massive operational waste of lazy, bloated corporate incumbents. Second, they can use a born open strategy. Think of the AI firm DeepSeek, rejecting patents and letting the open source community build and scale their product for them. And third, the slacker theory. This one suggests that having cognitive slack, or, a laid-back approach to problem solving, actually helps founders uncover the easiest, most creative solutions that super busy people completely overlook.
Okay, let's apply McLuhan's framework to see how this builds into product strategy. He divided media, and by extension, innovations, into hot and cold. So hot innovations are high definition. They lean heavily into existing infrastructure and demand very little user participation. But cold innovations? Those are low definition. They're scrappy. They require the user to actively participate to fill in the gaps, and because they fundamentally reorganize how we interact with the environment, they absolutely destroy incumbent advantages.
So, to wrap up this explainer, we can clearly see that entrepreneurship isn't just a single, easily defined trait. It's like a giant puzzle. It's a massive, complex spectrum of human behavior, systemic advantage, biology, and socioeconomic defiance. So, having explored all 21 of these highly controversial theories, what truly drives you to build? Are you an entrepreneur by choice, by biology, or by pure defiance? Take these theories, look at your own internal motivations, and keep pushing those boundaries. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.